lower the AC. I'll tell you. Hello. Welcome, everyone. We would like to get started, so everyone please take your seats. Thank you so much.
Good evening. Hi, everyone. Welcome. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you all this evening to a conversation. This is going to happen. I'll explain why in a minute, but it's going to happen throughout this evening. So we're very happy to have you all here for a conversation about exercising leadership in times of national crisis, ? And the question mark is not a typo, it's intentionally there. We were actually deliberating whether to keep the question mark or not, but we felt that there's a big question mark on what does it mean to exercise leadership in times of national crisis. I'm Ronit head. I'm vice president and head the Center for Israeli and Jewish Identity here at the Machon. And it is a real pleasure to have with me Tziona Koenig-Yair, currently executive vice president of the CLAIM conference. Before that, director general of the Ministry of Diaspora in the former Change government. And before that, vice president and head of the Center for Israeli and Jewish Identity at the Shalom Hartman Institute. So as you can understand, I stepped into her very elegant shoes 3 years ago almost, yeah? No, 3 years ago. Yeah, exactly 3 years ago. So that's why you see people hugging Tziona and waving to her from the audience. Before coming to Hartman, Tziona was the first national commissioner for equal employment opportunity. Did I say it right? And I actually know Tziona for, how old is Nitzan? 25. So the first time I met Tziona was in IWN, Israel's Women's Network. Nitzan, who was 8 months back then, was on a blanket on the floor. And I was very impressed. This was 25 years ago. It was before it was more common to have your child come with you to the office. And I was very impressed. I was very impressed with how it is actually happening. So Tziona doesn't only walk the talk, she actually shapes the talk by the way she walks. So
I never heard that one before.
I made it up for you, exactly. So really, it's a pleasure to have you here with us. And we're going to be in conversation about leadership, which is something we both love and dedicate a lot of our time to working on and developing. And why don't you start us off with some of the guiding principles that you hold and use in your leadership and management?
Okay, so first just to say how good it is to feel at home, especially in these times, to come back here to the beautiful Beit Midrash of Hartman. And I'm very proud to call myself the Shadchanit, the one who made the shidduch between Ronit and the Hartman Institute. So I'm very proud of that shidduch. And I really am, I don't want to say happy, but it really is good to see all of you in this very special place. As Ronit and I were discussing in preparation for this evening, I was trying to think about some of the guiding principles that I use or I think about when I'm trying to mobilize change at work or in my community. And one of the first things that came to mind is that the first and foremost, most important thing is that the work is at the center, right? And it sounds a little bit trivial, even as I say it now, but then if you can think for a moment about a situation where you're at work and people are talking about anything but the work, or if you're sitting around a boardroom, I know some of you have just finished a board meeting and I'm not an employee, so I feel free to say it, where different things are happening around that table, but it's not necessarily the most important piece of work. I think keeping the work at the center is something that is really always at the top of my mind. Making sure that all of that background noise, making sure that different egos, if you could put it that way, making sure that different agendas, sometimes conflicting agendas, doesn't get in the way of the actual mission that we've defined as the work at the center. And I think it's our role, when we assume it, to put the work at the center at all times. And I'm assuming we're going to come back to this during the conversation. The second thing that I thought about, and Ronit and I were discussing, is keeping a systematic perspective. So I think we're all very used to being in different roles and seeing what's on our table, or what's on our tables, or what's around us. And often it is not as simple to keep systematic view and keep all of the different perspectives around the given work in our minds. And in the adaptive leadership framework that Ronit and I engage in and exercise, or at least try to exercise, I like the phrase of the dance floor and the balcony. The balcony is where you pop up, where you go to get a full view of everything happening on the dance floor, including oneself, so that you're not disengaging from the dance floor, but rather you're watching, looking, observing everything happening on the dance floor from the balcony as you continue to assume your position on the dance floor. And I think that this enables us, as we're determining how to mobilize for change, to keep all perspectives in our minds as we're doing the work. As you'll see a little bit later in the conversation, easier said than done, but we're just at the theoretical stage, so I'm just putting it out there.
Everything is easier in theory.
Yes, absolutely. And the third and last thing that I want to highlight is the ability to give the work back to people, or at least try to. And when I say give the work back to people, what I mean is to ensure that people are taking responsibility for their piece in the mess. So automatically, a lot of us who do a lot of work will assume the responsibility of doing all the work. I find this sometimes happens at home with my children. But it's not at all about allocating tasks to other people, but rather recognizing that even if I have formal authority, it's not my work, or it's not only my work. And rather, everyone who has a piece in this balagan or in this challenge has to take responsibility for their piece of it. And the last thing I'll say about that is much harder to do when one thinks that one has a solution. Right? So if there's a problem and I'm the go-to person, I know what I have to do to solve the problem. But once I recognize that this problem is not only my problem, it's really imperative that we give the work back to the people and make sure they assume responsibility and do something about the problem that is actually situated with them.
But you mentioned formal authority, and if I take it to the context of being in a national crisis, I believe that October 7th and also October 8th and the weeks that came afterwards were very much colored by the lack of authorities and the lack of what we need authority to do for us as citizens. Yehuda spoke, I don't remember when, I think it was Wednesday, when he spoke about the fact that October 7th wasn't a pogrom, because after October 7th came October 8th, and those who were in the kibbutzim and in Sderot and Ofakim and were asking, where is the army came afterwards. It took time. It was very horrible. But the army came. The government didn't come. The ministries of the welfare ministry, housing ministry, even municipalities, it took them a long time to get to the work. And when there is no formal authority, I mean, authority is when we teach, we talk about authority as a resource. It's basically a service that it can be a resource for leadership, but it cannot be equated with leadership. And authority is basically about providing protection, direction, and order. That's what authorities are supposed to do. When we manage things, we want to ensure that the people that we're managing have the sense of protection, have the sense of direction, and there's order. And what happens when authorities fail to provide this service, fail to provide to their people, to the group, to the organization, or to society, fail to provide this service of protection, direction, and order. And that's what we saw on October 8th and afterwards. The weeks that came afterwards, we saw the lack of formal authority that cannot be, it couldn't provide this or address this need of being an orienting symbol for people. Now, I have to remind, or I don't have to remind us, because we know that this came after a year almost of a very challenging political situation in Israel and relationship between many factions in Israeli society, not all of them, but many factions within Israeli society who felt that leadership and authorities that are supposed to help people deal with clashes and confront their ideological clashes or values in a constructive way, instead of helping people do that, created situations where people were clashing or confronting each other. And so the need for leadership and the need for a guiding authority was very much there. What we saw on October 8th, and actually on October 7th itself, was civil society and activists who, with no formal authority, took the lead on creating solutions and providing services and addressing the needs of families who were evacuated. But these were very technical solutions. Many of them, even though they were very complicated, from addressing the need for laundry. Many evacuees, families who were here in Jerusalem and in other places, there was no place to do laundry. They created these magnificent WhatsApp groups where people volunteered to do laundry for families who were evacuated, volunteered to arrange rides for soldiers who had to go to the front, volunteered to help with babysitting for families when one of the parents or both parents had to go to the army. So that was a very technical solution that people were able to address, but then started to emerge the bigger questions, the questions that have to do with who we are and who will we be here as a society, and what are the values that we want to hold on to. And then that's a place where those people, and many of them, some of them you may have met here today, because there were 4 of them here, I think, in a conversational lunch this afternoon from a program called Chazon, a leadership training program that we've started because some of these activists who were very active in these command or civic command centers providing all this technical assistance came to us and said, we need the guidance because there are bigger questions here that we need to address and we don't have the capacity to address that. And that was showing leadership. That was understanding that from our informal authority, without having the formal authority that the government has. One of them said to us in a beautiful way, she said, I always thought that there's somewhere out there's this responsible adult, and they will know what to do. Like if something bad happens or if there's a difficult decision to make, somewhere, she's in her mid-20s, somewhere, there's an adult who will know what to do. October 7th meant and came along, and we realized that there is no responsible adult. She told us how she looked up one of the days in the few weeks after October 7th and looked around her in this civic command room and saw that all people are under the age of 30. And so what do we do when there is no formal authority to take the lead? And how do we exercise leadership in those situations? This is where there is no clear solution from within the system.
Yeah, and I think just looking around Israel, and I don't know exactly who you met, but I'm sure you've heard many, many stories over the past months. It's been incredible to see how people have exercised leadership, I would say, in any way or form beyond our imagination. And I think Ronit Chazon is an excellent example, but I'm sure that there are many more examples, and we want to give the work back to you to try to think for a moment, 3, 4, maximum 5 minutes, turn to the person on your right, on your left, someone that you want to speak to, and if you could come up with 1 or 2 examples of exercising leadership that you saw in your communities, in communities here in Israel, that you read about, that you saw. We're not going to have a lengthy conversation, unfortunately, just because of the format, but we will go and we will collect a number of examples if you can articulate it in 15 words. Did we say 15?
We said 10,
We
but we
said
can
10.
give them 15.
We said 10. If you can articulate it in 10 words. Okay, so really a couple of minutes just to talk about it and think about without authority. אני שכחתי מה אמרנו. בגלל זה התחלתי לדבר לאט. אמרת לי שאני עושה...
Okay. 30, okay, 30 more seconds. Okay, so we have two microphones, and I would like to ask you to raise your hand if you have the 10, oh, excellent, if you have the 10 words that talk about leadership. So we have 1, 2, 3, and yes.
I don't know about the 10, but
I'm very strict with the word.
soldiers drove south, left their cars there.
What? Can you start again, please?
Soldiers drove south and left their cars there. Families were left in the north without a car. How do you get them back together? So people drove down south, but oh wait, before you drive, you got to get the keys. So they wanted to get the keys. Well, one person can't do that. You need at least two people because one's got to get the car. And then you got to go find the car, and they're all white, all little four doors, right? You got to find the car and then drive it back home, right? They did this over and over again to get the cars back to the families.
Thank you. What a wonderful example. Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you. Firstly, it was amended to 15 words. It was amended to 15 words, and I did it in 12.
Okay, very good.
Rich Ukrainian convert Israeli girl at Columbia University charters planes to get Israelis home.
Thank you. Yep, for sure. Thank you very much. There was another one here and then here. Yes.
Israeli women in Los Angeles from the OTEP has arranged 2 trips for kids to come to Los Angeles as a means of recovery, and I'm helping her arrange a 3rd.
Yeah, thank you. Beautiful. And we have one more here, and then okay, and over there. Yes.
As a lighter example, at the encampment at University of Pennsylvania, the Jewish students formed the Boker Tov Brigade. So at 4 in the morning, they went out and woke up everybody in the encampment every morning.
That is wonderful. Yes, please.
Jewish day schools across North America absorbed many Israeli families and their students without questions, just took them in and then figured out whatever they needed to be of support.
Beautiful. Thank you. And last one. Hey, Ray.
Hi. Volunteer physician mobilization, 10,000 physicians worldwide within the first week.
Yeah. Wow. Amazing. So these are all quite remarkable examples, and I think the really common denominator between all of them is, or the common characteristic is the fact that they were all not formal roles. People were exercising leadership, and we will talk about it in a moment, but they were really dancing on the edge of authority. They have the example of the schools or the physicians. They have their role. The formal authority is defined by what is your role. Basically, it means that your job description defines your authority. And here they were taking it several steps forward and not just doing their job, but actually taking it and stretching it forward. And I know you did something very similar in the first 48 hours. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. I just want to say that I think that if we went around the room and we made it mandatory, each and every one in the room would have an example of something that happened without formal authority in these days. And just to pause for a moment and say that that's very inspiring. It's very inspiring, it's very heartwarming, and we need, I think, I need to hear these examples and to sort of relive the fact that there's a lot of good happening in these very terrible times. On the 7th of October, I had been in this new role as Vice President of the Claims Conference in Israel. We all know what the Claims Conference is, right? Okay, so I will say a word about that. I had been in the formal role, for 6 weeks. The Claims Conference is, I think, the largest, maybe the only organization, global organization, that deals with restitution, compensation from the German government to all Holocaust survivors worldwide. And so since 1952, from the first claims conference, where a bunch of Jewish American lawyers sued the German government, they have been renegotiating year after year, and we have been bringing compensation, again, restoration of art and property, education, documentation, and research about the Holocaust to Holocaust survivors worldwide. And the Israel office serves 144,000 Holocaust survivors that live in Israel, which is a little over 50% of the Holocaust survivors left in the world. And so on the 7th of October, when everything was unfolding, I was 6 weeks into this formal authority, in the formal role that I assumed. And and the global management sits in New York, And it was Simchat Torah, 2nd days. And most of the leadership is Shomer Shabbat, and there was actually no one to speak to. And as this was unfolding, in the morning of October 8th, we realized there were thousands of Holocaust survivors that needed to be evicted from their homes, and there were some hundreds that couldn't leave their homes, but they needed immediate assistance, be it food, be it water, be it medicine, be it psychological help, be it transportation, special transportation, whatever it is. And everything that we do goes through the German government. And when I say everything, you would not believe the detail that has to be approved by the German government before we move the dollars from side to side. Is this being taped? I hope not. Right? We're not being taped. Okay, so this is off the record. A lot of people to be off the record, but yeah, it's off the record. And it was the 8th of October, and my New York superior boss, the board, I really didn't have too many people to talk to. But I did have organizations calling me and saying, can we get the transportations of food to go to Sderot? Can we get this and this amount of money to transport Holocaust survivors from the north because they're starting to be bombarded there? Can we move people into safe rooms that we don't have, so we need to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And as you and I were discussing, Ronit, I didn't see that there was any other choice. And I didn't know what the protocol was to get this approved by the German government, and there really was no one to talk to on a Sunday in Germany, and as I said, on Simchat Torah in New York. But I committed to about 20 million shekels of things that we were gonna do ASAP. It was obvious that the government, who hadn't gotten its bearings yet, and I spoke to the person who took over my position in the government, Director General of the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs, and he was like, I have no idea what we're doing, don't even call me, I can't even answer the phone. So it was obvious that the government wasn't there, and it was obvious that Holocaust survivors couldn't be the first priority of a government when there are soldiers and there are families that aren't even identified. I'm just reminding us of the horrific first few weeks where we didn't even know how many victims there were, and soldiers were being deployed from everywhere to everywhere. And so I committed to that, and when Simchat Torah was over and I spoke to the people in New York, we went through the appropriate approval procedure, and since you're all probably very tense, it worked. It worked retroactively. I don't think it's to be repeated, and it needed to be very dire circumstances. But I do think, Ronit, that when we were talking about dancing on the edge of authority, I couldn't think of a better example than in those times.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful example that that you exercised, the way you exercise your leadership. But I want to note how difficult it is when you have a formal role. You have the commitments to the hierarchy in the organization. You have the commitments to who you are supposed to be in the formal role that you're in. And again, many of the examples that you just very briefly gave us here. And I think if we had a question mark at the beginning of the conversation of what is exercising leadership in national crisis, I think this is one of the things that we see happening, where people are taking their formal roles and pushing them in the same way that you did. And so this idea of dancing on the edge of your own authority, of challenging what your organization or what your community has been doing up till now, and making a major shift, a very fast shift. 20 million shekels is not, it's a big chunk of money.
You know, it worked very well because we then doubled that and we made it 40 million. So, and just to say that the Holocaust survivors in Israel are being taken care of very, very well in this terrible time. And if you heard Yosef Wiener, a Holocaust survivor from Poland, speak about losing his 2 grandchildren in Kfar Aza on the 7th of October, and speaking about moving to Israel, building a new life, you know, really settling here, and then, so it's very well deserved and very much needed, so well worth the effort.
And I think this also connects us to the deeper questions, and it's going back to the questions of who will we be when this war is over, and who will we be in the day after, who will we be when we rise from the ashes. Those are the big ideological questions that we're dealing with in Israel, and a lot of the examples that we're seeing with the exercising of leadership and dancing on the edge of authority, and again, I'm referring to those young activists that we work with, going to those questions and asking them, because Israel has been dealing with ideological clashes and tensions for years. Well, actually, shouldn't say dealing, because we haven't been dealing. We've been avoiding them. We've been avoiding the very difficult questions of what does it mean to be Zionist today? Is Zionism, if I go back to Michal's conversation this morning, she was giving us a glimpse of what is the faction. She was describing the faction that I had a difficulty hearing. She was also describing how difficult it was for her to hear those thought leaders from the national religious faction who have a very different view of what is Zionism for her, for the Shalom Hartman Institute. Is that the Zionism that we will have here in Israel, or is it the Zionism that we talk about, which is standing up for moral values and holding power and morality together? Are we going to be, if I go back to Tal's conversation yesterday, are we going to be the people who dwell alone, the people who dwells alone, or are we going to be those who work with our allies and build geopolitical partnerships in order to address the challenges? Who are we going to be? Are we going to be, what does it mean to be an Israeli Jew? Does it mean just to live here? Does it mean to take responsibility and take your own share of the burden? Including drafting into the army, which is a major issue now in Israeli society with the ruling of the Supreme Court last week and a bill that is not being drafted for the enlistment of the ultra-Orthodox and Haredis to the army. So these are the really big questions that, as you said at the beginning, we don't have the solutions in the system. The system doesn't have solutions for them. So how do we address them?
Yeah, so is everybody familiar with the ultra-Orthodox bill? Did you do any? Yeah, okay. So I want to go back to something we started with and apologize for saying something very different than I did at the beginning, because theoretically, I agree with whatever I said.
I told you it's very easy in
Yeah.
theory.
And like Daniel says, that could be inspirational, right? But in practice, it's much more complicated. And I think that we are at a historical point in time, and I said this to you, Ronit, numerous times over the conversation, where I would love to look at this with an adaptive lens and say we have to give this back. We have to give the work back to the ultra-Orthodox community to deal with this conflict in values and what it means to be a Jewish ultra-Orthodox person living in Israel in 2024. But that was before October 7th. That was before our forces were depleted. That was before we don't have enough soldiers to go around now on the 4 different fronts that we are. 2 fronts in Gaza, 1 in Ayosh, and 1 in the north. And it's not really 1 in the north, it's more than 1 in the north if you ask someone who understands army. That was before so many people sacrificed their lives so that we could sit here and talk about the values of being a Jewish person in Israel in 2024. And for me personally, that was before my son-in-law, who was in the north for 5.5 months, has now been in Gaza for 5 weeks, and he has another 4.5 weeks ahead of him. And I can't get on the balcony. I can't keep that all perspective and listen to a narrative that I think is almost impossible to hear when reality is such a harsh reality as we have in Israel, where there are different types of citizens in Israel who have your different, like your class A, class B, you have different obligations and different privileges. And I think there comes a time where where a government has to say, we tried it the adaptive way. We tried to be in conversation. We did a lot of work to try to get people to speak about this value clash and to come to some type of an agreement, and it's not there. Personally, I think this is a time to pass a law that says you're a Jewish citizen in Israel. We can talk about the Arabs a different time. We have a stand on that, but that's besides it's beyond our time today. There are certain obligations you have, and you have to fulfill those obligations, not because it's a value, but because it's a necessity, because that's the life we're living in Israel from 2024. So I want to go back to what I started with and go back to my apology, because I do think this is an adaptive challenge for Israeli society. But sometimes we can't pace the work and we can't lead in adaptive change. Not because we don't want to, not because we don't believe in that that's the right way, but just because the harsh reality is banging down the door and threatening our existence, our very existence. And yes, there's also a justice piece to this. There's also a piece of justice where I feel like the examples you gave shows Am Yisrael Chai, right? It shows the best of the Jewish spirit and values that come out in a time of crisis. And there's not one interpretation of that, right? People come from different walks of life, different denominations, different ways of practicing Judaism as a religion, as history, as a culture. Not necessarily the same thing, but there are certain things that have to be what we call Yahareg Vebal Ya'avo, and in more than one way.
Yahareg Vebal Ya'avo means will be killed and shall not pass.
We can't not be who we are meant to be. And I think that we're at that point in Israeli society.
So I agree and I disagree. First of all, I very much agree, and I want to reiterate and go back a little bit to what you said, that it's impossible to be on the balcony. It's impossible to be on the balcony when the situation is so heated, when the temperature is so high. For those of you who were at the demonstrations last night, it's bring the hostages back now. It's in Tel Aviv more than in Jerusalem. It's elections now. And we've been in this now for a long time. But there's no pacing when you cry out now. It has to happen now. And we're all in an emergency state still. I'm worried that it won't work by force with the ultra-Orthodox. And I very much believe that, yes, there has to be I don't know if it's an incentive or motivator, but at the end of the day, we do have to give the work back. And the solution lies where the problem is. In the same way that the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredis, managed to find ways to integrate at least some of them into the workforce. And I know this is I know it's difficult. It's difficult for you even more emotionally because of having a son-in-law now in the war, and I cannot even imagine how much anger towards the ultra-Orthodox it has. And I'm hearing people talk, and I cannot understand how mothers in the ultra-Orthodox community are willing even to hear the sentence that we're afraid that if we send our sons to the army, they will come back not Haredi, when mothers are worried that they send their children to the army and they won't come back. And so it's very clear why it's very hard to pace now. But at the end of the day, I believe that it will have to happen from those within the community who will find the ways to do it, not just by coercion and not just by now the numbers, the ultra-Orthodox, the army is saying we can enlist 3,000 more ultra-Orthodox. There are now currently about 1,800. Not all of them are Haredis, but to have a larger number, if it doesn't come from within, it won't be a sustainable change. And I think it's most of all, what does it mean to be a Jew in Israel? What does our Judaism mean? What does Judaism mean when we're not only fighting, and again, this goes back to Michal's conversation in the morning, when for us, saying the Kedushat Torah is also saying our responsibility for Am Yisrael and for the people who live here with us.
Yeah, so I think, and when we open up, I'm really happy to hear your thoughts on this, that we're past that moment. We're past that moment where we are naive enough to think that it'll come from inside. There have been so many points in time and so many opportunities over the last 8 months where we have seen, I would say, a negligent lack of leadership. We've seen absolutely no compassion and empathy or any leadership from the ultra-Orthodox. Now, I don't think that there aren't wonderful people in the ultra-Orthodox community who would probably want to volunteer or who would probably be happy to take part in Army service and do what they have to do. But we're here talking about leadership. From my perspective, there's been a total lack of leadership. And there hasn't even been an opening. So we're not talking about drafting the entire ultra-Orthodox community, but we're talking about something. And adaptation can happen when there is a recognition that there's a problem. Here, not only is there not a recognition that there's a problem, but rather the problem is being given back to the rest of Israel. And it's being defined in a totally different way. We are doing our piece by praying, which I think is an important thing. It's an important part. I know a lot of soldiers, including my son-in-law, who prays every morning. I don't know if it's to the same God, but, you know, they pray. And that's it. That's our role in society. And so I think that we have a preliminary problem of not even agreeing on what the problem is. And therefore, giving that work back to them and trying to change from inside is, yeah, I don't know.
So I think the definition of the problem is becoming clearer, and part of what's, I wouldn't say good about the discussion that is happening publicly is that we're starting to hear the different points of view regarding this problem. But at the end of the day, we need to have leadership that will be able to communicate the losses, that the ultra-Orthodox, that the Haredi community will have to accept as part of this change. And, you know, we compared it to COVID. It's funny, we start reminiscing about COVID, and I have to say that I literally find myself these days missing the times when we were in COVID. It sounds insane, I know, and I'm sorry, I hope I'm not offending anyone, but it seems like during COVID, we had to incur a loss, a very meaningful, significant loss, like bevat achat, from like in one day, no more face-to-face meetings.
It wasn't that big a loss if you think about it.
No, but you're saying it now.
Okay, I'm just joking.
You're saying it now because for all of us now, it's obvious that we can do meetings on Zoom, right? No one, like, if I have a meeting in Tel Aviv and it doesn't really work with my schedule, I just move it to Zoom. I know there are people who are seeing this online. We couldn't think like that 5-6 years ago. I was working with people who were former Army generals who couldn't understand how do you have a conversation when you don't have a whiteboard next to you. They need to write on whiteboards while they talk. And literally, one of them who was in what was bidud, confinement, was, how do you call it? Yeah. So he had to be in confinement, and he was in his bedroom. We were on Zoom, and he had this huge whiteboard that he brought in so he can talk and write at the same time. But this was a loss that we were I think we were afraid of that loss. I know about myself, it's hard to teach or to do work over Zoom because you don't have the or people like the giggling, and you miss a lot of the interaction. But we learned to adapt, and we saw the benefit, and we managed to differentiate what's the precious things that we want to keep and maintain, and what are the expendable things that we can let go of.
Yeah, this is very different. I agree with you. This is very different than COVID in that the losses that different factions in the Israeli map will incur are very, very significant losses. They are significant because it goes to the core of their beliefs and their values. And so if the ultra-Orthodox community decides, and they show leadership, to get drafted into the army, it goes against, whether it resonates with us or not, it goes against their core being. It goes against their DNA. It goes against their core beliefs and values. And at the same time, if they don't go into the army, we're at that point in time where it goes against the core beliefs of many factions in the Israeli society that see the army as part of our I would say, national DNA, part of who we are, part of our identity, our national identity. And so we find ourselves in a situation where there's a clash, and such a frontal clash, you say, that the losses that each will incur, people are willing to give up a lot, not to step back from that. And when we get to a point like that, obviously, I don't know what the middle point is. And that's why I said I suggest that it be a law, that it be something that is a different example, but maybe not a great one, you'll tell me, I just thought of it now, we didn't talk about this before, is the law against sexual harassment in Israel. It was very hard to enact that law here in Israel. And those who were drafting the law and working on that law, it took us many, many years to pass the law in Israel. And when it passed, it was a joke. It was like, really? We're not going to stop flirting at work, or we're not going to stop saying this and this at work. And today, it's a norm. So, lahavdil, I want to say, let's pass a law, a very tough law, and then we can negotiate everything else.
So we spoke about, okay. I agree a bit more. I didn't think I'll get to agree a bit more, but
it's a live negotiation right now, by the way.
No, because I think that and again, with the COVID example, there wasn't any normative conflict. It was very, like, there were some normative conflicts, but here it's really, I remember a rabbi who said, like, in a conversation, they're slipping between our fingers. And I cannot ignore that. But I think this is something we just have to continue keep in mind, because that's also our part of the mess. You spoke earlier about how do we make sure that each faction takes responsibility of their part of the mess. That's my part of the mess, at least, or the faction I belong to. Of how do I see things differently? How do I practice curiosity with those that I deeply disagree with? And I want to take this, because we spoke about trying to understand reality, the diagnosis part, and the balcony, which is so hard to get onto now. By the way, I may have mentioned this to some people when I teach adaptive leadership now with Chazon folks, who some of them are protesters, and you saw maybe some of them yesterday, and I tell them that there's a need to get on the balcony when you're exercising leadership, and because they're out there in demonstrations, I tell them, so you don't have a balcony there, but you can get on the fence in front of the president's house. There is a fence. You can get on the fence to see, instead of the dance floor, look at the demonstration floor, like see who's shouting, who's not, who's participating, who isn't. So think about this metaphor of getting on the fence. And they said to me, if you get on the fence, you'll be arrested. So that's not what I mean. But so we spoke about the need to examine, to take this step back, which is so hard in times of conflict, of high conflict and trauma. But how do we intervene? What does intervention look like?
So I think as we're navigating our own leadership and thinking about what's happening, if we can get on the balcony and see what's happening with the different perspectives and with the different factions in Israel, I don't know if everybody agrees with this, but I feel a very deep sense of urgency to intervene into the system, to do something, not to stay at home. And I don't mean only going to work and doing my day job, but I mean doing something that will move the needle, even if it's a little bit. And for a lot of people, conversing and speaking at synagogue, in our community, at work, most people are like, look, I don't have any power. What can I do? I'm not in the government. I'm not in the army. I'm not of age. I can volunteer. And I think that's a big question that we're struggling with. How do I intervene into a system? How do I move things in the right direction, or in the direction that I think is right, to do something better? So, quick personal story that obviously comes back to Hartman. After exhausting my somewhat mediocre baking skills and giving out cakes to every parent in the moshav I live in. I live in a small community in the south of Israel. So anyone who has children in the army, I baked a cake and I didn't get any, everyone was like, thumbs up. You know you're doing something wrong if you're baking and you're only getting a thumbs up, right? So after exhausting that possibility, and after being exhausted from all the fights and screaming matches that my husband and I have been having with colleagues and former friends about the situation in Israel, I thought we really need some facilitated discussion. We really need to go back to our core identity. For me, that's easy. My parents named me Tziona because they wanted to move from the States to Israel, going to Zion, right? So I really going back to those core Zionistic, liberal, I would say Jewish values that I grew up on, and trying to look at the gaps that we've opened in Israeli society through those lenses. And so I begged Daniel to do something in our community, and we had a 5-part series in my home where we were a little over 40 people, half of them who I would say hold very different opinions than my husband and I I wanted to say on what, but on everything. Politically, religiously, even about the hostages, right? Being criticized for wearing this from the day it came out, on everything, which is it. I don't get it, right? But they don't get me either. So that was the point. And we sat down. Each session was close to 4 hours, where a thought leader came from Hartman and spoke about one of the issues that you probably spoke about over the last few days. And then we had an open conversation that was facilitated by someone. And that enabled us, incredibly and surprisingly, to have a more low-temperature conversation about values. And the encouraging thing that came out of that was there were some things that we agreed on. There were some things that we could say, this is a shared value for all of us. This is something that's important to all of us. This is something we want to preserve. And there was the ability to listen, as difficult as it was, and it was very difficult, to things that were very different than what each and every one of us in the room wanted to hear. And you might be asking yourself, okay, so great, so what kind of an intervention is that, right? What have you moved forward in Israeli society? So I'll say 2 out of the many things that came out of this. Number 1, everyone there committed to do one thing to move this forward, to speak to one group of friends, to take this to work, to bring in someone from Hartman to speak about this theoretically and then bring it to a practical level, to do one thing. Second, we continue to meet in subgroups of this group to continue the conversation. Now I go back to where I started. We're not decision makers right now, right? I'd give anything to go back to the previous government where we were in that position to make decisions, but we're not. And the easiest thing to say is, well, there's not much we can do. But the harder question, and I would say obligation as citizens of Israel as a country, and of us as citizens of the Jewish people, the global Jewish community, is what can we do? It's very, very easy, and it comes to mind 23/7, what we can't do. But then in that last hour of the day, every day, I think we have an obligation to ask ourselves, so what can we do? What can we do for Israel? What can we do for the global Jewish people as a people until we have risen from these horrific times?
Thank you for this. I remember I don't know how long ago, some years ago, when we were working on some workshop that we were planning together, and you put forward the question, what would progress look like, as the first exercise that we wanted to give to the group. And I keep having and asking myself this question all the time. What would progress look like in this situation? Not just what would leadership look like, but what would be in this so difficult situation now in Israel? And I think what you described, the ability to be in conversation, not for the sake of unity. Unity is important, but what's more important is to address the questions and not to avoid the big elephants in the room, and not to continue with the avoidance that Israel has been avoiding for 76 years of so many hard questions. The one, I don't know if it's not a good thing, but the one maybe productive thing that is happening is that all these questions are surfacing in a way that we can't continue to avoid them. And so asking the questions, and we call it, and we've mentioned it here a few times, we call it being in the war of the spirit. I call it the soul front. We have the home front and we have the soul front. So how do we engage effectively in ensuring that these questions are being asked? And how do we engage effectively in addressing these identity questions in a way that is valuable, not just so that people will necessarily agree, but that people will have a stronger understanding of who we are and who we're committed to be. And whether it's with educators or with army officials and officers or with people who are asking themselves, who do we want to be? And not just confine ourselves to being in emergency, in emergency mode, which is so easy to just continue being in that sense of emergency. And so yes, I think that part of the real importance of intervention is just staying with the questions and being with the identity questions that we need to continue looking at. Which I think is a great segue to open up for some questions. Nachon? Okay, questions, yes. Microphones, there will be microphones, yes.
There are different forms of leadership. I think almost all the examples that were mentioned before were task-related. In many cases, one-ups. It happens once, you take care of it, and it's done. Other leadership is much more complicated. For example, I think everybody would like to see the release of the hostages. Some people say the way to do it is to fight a war, have the people down there, have the Arabs thinking that their back's against the wall, and to release the hostages then. Other people say, stop the war. Those two things cannot exist at the same time. Leadership, I think, is the ability to sort out the fact that there are conflicting, valid reasons to do things that are in conflict. How do you resolve that kind of thing and be able to move forward? Thanks.
Let's take two questions at a time and then relate to them. Yes, Dan. There's a microphone coming up to you.
First, thank you for the presentation. I thought it was terrific. But what I found absent from it was 20% of the population here. I mean, 20% are Israeli Arabs. And I understand we were talking about Jewish identity and Jewish conversation, but that's how they're Israeli citizens. And what do we say to them, for them? How do we exercise leadership for them, encourage leadership for them? I don't know whether Chazon has or is planning a Palestinian component. I mean, you talk about the elephant in the room. That's one elephant in the room, even putting aside the occupation, which is a dinosaur in the room. But at least here, these are citizens, and I missed that.
So I want to say to that I don't think that Ronit and I, that's my opinion, can speak on behalf of the Arab faction in these days. And you're probably right that we should have a third party sitting at this coffee table who's an Arab woman speaking about these issues. But Katonti, I would not speak for the Arab population in these days. I can barely speak for my own faction, to be honest. So it's not an all-encompassing conversation. We haven't exhausted we haven't even gotten to everything that Ronit and I thought that we would speak about. And it's not an elephant in the room just because I would admit that that is a missing piece of it. But I really wouldn't, not aspire, I'm looking for the word, lityamer. I wouldn't presume. I wouldn't presume to even be able to start that. That's a different evening conversation where to be able to address that, the people who are sitting here have to include Arabs. I will say one thing about that as it pertains to Haredi. I think it would also be very important to have a Haredi man or woman sitting here and for you to hear it from them and not for us to speak what we've interpreted as their perspective from what I've tens of conversations over the last time. So I'm agreeing with you, I guess.
I will add to that I think I see our responsibility as ensuring that Jews can have the conversation, acknowledging that there are 20% of the citizens in Israel who are not Jews, who are Arabs, who are Palestinians, who are Israeli citizens. So my audience is the Jewish people who should remember and understand exactly what you were saying, that there is a 20% of this population who identifies as Arab Palestinian, who are in deep pain, like we're all in deep pain, but they have the deep pain of what's happening here and what's happening in Gaza at the same time. So it's not with them that I need to do the work. It's with my people who I need to do the work with so that they will see them, and that when they talk about leadership, they see their role vis-a-vis all factions in Israeli society. And some of the greatest disagreements, very painful disagreements that I have with other Israelis is around that question, around the question whether or not they are citizens who are just deserve not only the equality of rights, but the equality of identity. Their identity is valid in the same way, even if we're currently in a situation of war, not with their people, we're at war with the Hamas. And most Israelis don't remember that. Most Israelis think we're in war with Palestinians. You can start.
Just to go back to your question briefly, I think that's exactly what we're talking about, right? I think the way you posed it is exactly what Ronit and I have been trying to do here and to discuss. You'll get a different answer from us than you'll get from someone else. Having said that, on that particular issue, the formal authority, AKA the government of Israel, is the one making decisions on that particular issue. Our interventions or our aspirations to exercise leadership on this issue can only be without formal authority on a civil level. And there my answer is that at times like this, we all have to do what we believe is right. There are different interpretations, there really are. And we have to do what we feel is right in the moment as leadership. I'll share with you a very sensitive conversation I had with my son-in-law before entering Gaza last week for the second time. I called him. My daughter doesn't know yet. God help me when she finds out. I said to him, you know, we love you, we respect you. We won't respect you less if you decide not to go in with your battalion this time to Gaza. He's exhausted. He's been on the go for close to 8 months with a 3-week break. He'll probably lose his job. I said to him, I said, you know, you're tired. I don't know who else is going in. I'm speaking as a mother-in-law. I'm not speaking as the head of the claims conference, and I'm not speaking as a professional Jew. I'm speaking to you. And he listened, very respectful. He's a sweet kid. He's probably scared of me. And he said, thank you very much for calling, but I have to go. And that's my duty. And that's what it means to be an Israeli soldier at this particular time. That's what it means to be a citizen of this state and to fight for what I do believe is right, even if I don't believe in war. But for you guys to sleep at night, he says to me, to know that his wife, my daughter, is sleeping okay in Tel Aviv, he has to go there. So we can each intervene into this in a way that we think we're exercising leadership to the best of our feeling, knowledge, and ability when we're in the middle of a crisis.
Yes, Jackie.
This is about the Orthodox in all its denominations going into the army. And I feel that, you know, this should be part of citizenship in the state of Israel. And, you know, they aren't going to like it in the beginning because it's something new. It's a big change from what has been for a long time, but sometimes there's a saying, fake it till you make it, and that's exactly kind of what has to happen. And now for the question, senior moment. I've been waiting for so long, I don't remember what exactly it was that I was going to ask. Oh, no, it's definitely not just you. And actually, I spoke to somebody today who was much younger, and she said, and I also am having these issues. So,
we'll take another question and come back to you. How's that?
thank you.
Thank you, Kim. And just to say, Jackie, regarding what you, I will now have a senior moment, but I think that the idea of each one having to find their way of connecting to this duty. And, it reminded you what you wanted to say? Okay, great. But it's my hope, and this goes back to our somewhat of a disagreement, is that once it is forced on the ultra-Orthodox young men, because it's not going to be this permit that is given to all of them not to go to even to be in any contact with the army. Some of them will probably now have to have some interaction with the army. Maybe they will learn things that they don't know. That's what you're worried about?
No, that's not me.
Oh, that's what they're worried about.
Mothers and the fathers.
That's what they're, yes, but I believe that there is a way of not dealing with it as a zero-sum game, as a binary problem. And I think that's the work of adaptation. That's the ability to filter what is precious and you want to hold on to and what is expendable. And that's the work I hope they will be doing.
So what I really wanted to ask was, there was a whole issue of national service. And people could, if they didn't want to go into the army, they could do 2 years of national service. What has happened to that concept?
Okay, so we'll address that. Thank you. Let's take another question. Yes.
Oh, hi, I'm Toby Green. I'm from the UK. Tziona, you gave an anecdote about your engagement with your successor at the Ministry for Diaspora Affairs on October the 7th or October the 8th. And we've heard a lot about government going missing, basically, after October the 7th. And I'm just wondering if you can explain that. What was the reason for the poor level of government performance? Was it was just an overwhelming situation, and even if you had a really functioning government system, anybody would have been overwhelmed? Was it that the ministers were inadequate, incompetent, or self-interested? Was it that the civil service itself was just hollowed out after years of government neglect, election after election, and then 10 months of chaos, a year of chaos? Was it all of the above, or is it something else? And looking forward, what will it take to return Israeli public services in general back to a decent level of functioning? Is it just a change of political leadership, or is it something much deeper than that?
How long do you have?
I think that'll be
start
the
with
last
that one.
That'll be the last question, I think.
That will
What's
be the
that?
last question? Okay.
Where to start, seriously. So I think it's a really tough question. And I want to start by saying that I'm not inside the government. And besides that one conversation, that was the beginning and end of it. So I don't have any inside information. And everything I'm saying is we have a forum of director generals from the previous government. And we meet periodically. And so it's sort of from that internal forum that I'm speaking. I think that it's a very dysfunctional government for 3 reasons. One, because of who leads it and the way he's leading. I would say lack of leadership. 2, because the professional level who usually does the work, right? It's not really the ministers who do the work, are not professional. They're political appointees. And for the most part, I would say 80%, at least 16 that we counted, are not professional managers or director generals or professionals that know the profession of the particular ministry. And 3, because the third reason is because when things started unfolding, there was no allocation of tasks or powers. There wasn't, okay, so we have now an emergency situation, the Army's doing their thing, but we need to break up what happens with the Ministry of Housing. We need to break up what happens with Bituach Leumi. We need to look at the elderly. There was no, let's get a team or teams together and let's mobilize those. And that's a fact. Now, those teams are in place 8 months down the line. But those teams should have been in place on October 9th, the latest. And so when we had COVID, or the occurrence of COVID in the government where we led, and it's lahavdil, because obviously it's a much lesser catastrophe, there were 6 director generals who got a mandate to write up a report in 24 hours, an all-nighter, and to present it to the government, and then the ministers made a decision and allocated that power to 2 of the director generals. I was excluded, minor detail, and they afterwards did that work. That's the way a functioning government works. So I started with the head, because I think everything starts obviously with the head, but those 3 components, if I have to give a short answer, and this is the shortest I could do it, are the 3 major components of the failure of the government as I, Tziona Koenig-Yair, see it, in no formal authority role.
So just to wrap up, and Jackie, the very short answer to the issue of Shirut Leumi, or national service, is yes, that's a possibility, but that's not what we need now. We need soldiers, unfortunately. That's where we are, which is why it's a challenge. And I want to wrap up by saying that, again, if we ask ourselves the questions, both of what does leadership look like during a national crisis, and also the question of who will we be when this is over, or when we rise from the ashes, and who will we be in the future? I think that's the orienting question that we're constantly so afraid of. Where is this leading us? And when you look at public conversations in Israel about certain decisions or statements that are being made, it's not always about the actual decision or statement, but where is it leading us? And I think that's also where the hope lies, because if we shift the steering wheel even a little bit, even just by 1 or 2 degrees to the north or to the east, we know that the ship will get someplace else. And so our work and our leadership work, and of all of us here in the room, is to make this effort of shifting or turning the steering wheel even 1 or 2 degrees to another side that will take us to a better future.
Yeah. I'll say that as a 3rd generation to 4 Holocaust survivors that made it over to the States, and then we made it over to Israel, we can't afford to talk about what's not going to work. We don't have the luxury. We just don't. As citizens of the global Jewish people, and myself as a citizen of Israel, I think we have to be worthy to the people that we are a part of, and to the soldiers who were sacrificed in this particular war to ensure that we have a safer future. And we have to be worthy of the 120 hostages that are still being held in Gaza. And I hope you join me in the prayer that next time we meet, and well before that, all of them are back here home in Israel, and that our soldiers have returned safely to their homeland, and that we can all be part of a better future. And to do that, we all have to connect to our sense of purpose, who we are, why we are, and where we are in doing better for the Jewish people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Speaking of the hostage families, they did a great job in organizing themselves